Some houses hold time the way a dry stone wall holds the heat of an October afternoon, long after the sun has slipped behind the hills. They keep the shape of the hands that built them, the weight of the footsteps that crossed their floors for half a century, and the quiet spaces left behind when the voices grow still. This is a house of timber and old paint, of floorboards that remember every winter gale that ever swept down from the Canadian border. It is a house that belongs to Margaret Whitmore. At 76, Margaret moves through its rooms with the deliberate grace of someone who knows every nail, every draft, and every shadow by heart. Her silver hair is gathered in a soft, loose bun at the nape of her neck. Her eyes retain the clear, warm blue of a northern sky after a cleansing rain, framed by fine laughter lines earned across decades of genuine joy. She wears a cream cable-knit cardigan over a long burgundy skirt and comfortable brown leather walking shoes. On her left ring finger, a simple gold wedding band catches the low slanting light of a November morning. She is a woman of quiet dignity, untouched by bitterness, though she carries the immense and private gravity of a long grief. For 48 years, that mantelpiece held the centre of her world. Thomas had built this house with his own hands, hauling the fieldstone for the foundation from the lower meadow behind the brook. He was a man of few words and steady hands, a carpenter who understood that wood needed time to dry before you planed it, just as life needed patience before you tried to shape it. When he left her 2 winters ago, the silence that followed was not merely the absence of his voice, it was a physical presence in the rooms. It settled upon the braided rugs in the parlour. It gathered in the corners of the kitchen where the copper pots hung silent and bright. Margaret did not rail against the quiet. She honoured it, the way one honours a guest who has stayed too long after the party has ended. She rose before dawn, boiled water in the same chipped enamel kettle Thomas had given her on their 10th anniversary, and sat by the north-facing window with a single mug of black coffee, watching the frost form intricate fern patterns on the glass. She tended to her days with methodical care. She mended her winter woolens by the light of a brass lamp. She dusted the oak bookshelves where Thomas had kept his volumes of poetry and local history. She walked the perimeter of the stone fence when the air was sharp enough to bite at her cheeks, her breath pluming white against the grey timberline. But the house had grown too large for one pair of footsteps. The hallways felt long, and the evenings stretched out like empty fields, waiting for a plough that would never come. She found herself talking to the empty air, not out of loneliness, but from the simple habit of sharing the world with someone who had always been there to answer. The town of Oakhaven lay 3 miles down the winding country road, a cluster of white-steeped churches, brick storefronts, and maple-shaded lanes that seemed determined to remain in another century. People knew Margaret there. They greeted her with gentle deference when she walked down to the post office or stopped at the bakery for a single loaf of seeded rye. They offered kind inquiries and sympathetic nods, but everyone knew the boundary line of a great sorrow. They gave her space, which was right and respectful, yet space had a way of turning into an invisible wall. Margaret never complained. She carried her groceries in a woven basket, paid exact change, and returned home before the early winter dusk settled over the hills. She knew that grief was not an illness to be cured, nor a puzzle to be solved. It was a landscape she had to walk across, step by slow step, until the ground beneath her feet felt solid again. Yet there were moments, especially when the wind whistled under the eaves and rattled the loose panes in the pantry, when she longed for something simpler than endurance. She longed for a living presence, not a replacement for what was lost, because nothing could ever replace Thomas, but a companion who asked for nothing more complicated than a warm hearth and a place to rest his head. The idea came to her not in a flash of inspiration, but as a quiet realization during a Tuesday morning snow flurry. She had been staring at the empty space beside the wood stove where Thomas's worn leather armchair still sat, its seat indented by his weight. The house was too full of ghosts and not enough of the present. She washed her coffee mug, dried it with a linen towel, and placed it neatly in the cupboard. Then she put on her heavy wool coat, tied her red scarf around her neck, and walked out to the old Ford truck that sat in the gravel drive. The engine turned over after a second cough, sending up a puff of blue exhaust into the freezing air. She drove slowly down the unpaved road, her tires crunching over the frozen ruts, toward the county animal shelter located on the southern edge of town. It was a modest brick building surrounded by tall pines, far enough from the highway that the only sounds were the wind in the needles and the occasional distant bark of a dog waiting for someone to walk through the heavy steel door. Margaret parked by the side of the gravel lot, turned off the engine, and sat for several minutes with her hands resting on the steering wheel. She was not entirely sure what she was looking for, but she knew she was ready to listen if something spoke to her across the silence. The shelter smelled of cedar shavings, disinfectant, and simple animal warmth. The staff moved with quiet efficiency, hosing down concrete floors, refilling stainless steel water bowls, and speaking in low, soothing tones to the residents of the runs. Most of the dogs were young, bounding against the wire with high-pitched barks and frantic paws, eager for any hand that reached out to them. Margaret walked slowly past the enclosures, her boots clicking softly on the sealed floor. She paused at each gate, offering a brief, gentle word, observing the way each animal handled the confinement and the waiting. Near the end of the long corridor, in a corner run that received the softest light from a western window, sat a dog who did not jump or bark. He was a medium-sized golden mixed-breed rescue, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, with a coat the colour of dried wheat, a broad white patch on his chest, and matching white socks on his front paws. His ears were soft and floppy, framing dark, intelligent brown eyes that held a steady, unhurried patience. A faint, healed scar marked his left shoulder, evidence of some old scrape from a time before the shelter found him. He lay curled on a faded green blanket, his chin resting on his paws, watching Margaret approach with an expression of quiet dignity that matched her own. Margaret did not reach out her hand right away. She knelt down on the cool concrete, her movements unhurried, and simply looked at him. The dog lifted his head, gave a single slow thump of his tail against the floorboards, and rose with an easy, fluid motion. He walked across the enclosure without urgency, came to the wire mesh, and pressed his black nose against the gap between the links. Margaret raised her hand and let the back of her fingers rest against the cool metal. The dog inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring as he took in her scent, the wood smoke and wool and old cedar. Then he let out a soft sigh that seemed to carry away half the chill in the room. A shelter attendant, a young man with kind eyes and a clipboard, walked up quietly behind her. "That is Oliver," the attendant said in a low voice, so as not to startle them. "He's been with us 3 months. He was found wandering near the timber mill over in the next county. Nobody came looking for him, but he is gentle as they come, doesn't bark at the other dogs, just watches and waits. He had a rough time of it out there in the timber breaks before our truck picked him up, but he healed up fine." Margaret did not look back at the attendant. Her eyes remained locked with the dog's deep brown gaze. She knew at that moment that she was not rescuing him, and he was not waiting to be saved. They were simply 2 creatures who recognized the familiar shape of solitude in one another. The ride home in the truck was quiet. Oliver sat on the passenger side of the bench seat, his front paws neatly planted on the rubber floor mat, his head turned toward the window as the snow-covered stone walls and leafless orchards slid past in a blur of white and grey. He did not pant or whine. When Margaret parked by the side porch and opened the door, he stepped down into the crisp air, gave his coat a single, vigorous shake, and followed her up the wooden steps without a leash. Inside the house, the transition was so seamless, it felt less like an arrival and more like a return. Oliver walked into the kitchen, his tail swaying in a slow, rhythmic arc, and conducted a thorough, respectful inspection of the room. He sniffed the base of the wood stove, touched his nose to the corner of the oak table where Thomas's boots had sometimes been left, and then walked over to the woven rug by the hearth. He turned around twice and settled down with a contented sigh, his chin resting on his paws, right where the radiant heat from the fire met the cool draught of the floorboards. Margaret stood by the counter, watching him, her hands resting on the smooth wood. The house no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by a presence that knew how to listen. Over the next few weeks, Oliver proved to be a dog of remarkable discipline and profound gentleness. He learned the rhythm of the farmhouse before the first week was out. He knew that the front parlour was a place for quiet afternoons, that the back mudroom was where wet paws were wiped with a coarse linen cloth, and that the long walks along the timberline were times for exploration rather than pursuit. He never bolted, never chewed on the antique furniture, and never made a sound unless a stranger approached the gate, and even then his warning was nothing more than a deep, resonant note that vibrated in the floorboards rather than a frantic bark. As the deep winter months closed in, locking the New England hills under a heavy crust of white and ice, the routine of the farmhouse deepened into something resembling a sacred order. Mornings began before dawn. While the stars still burned cold and sharp above the ridge, Margaret would stir the embers in the wood stove and drop in a fresh split of seasoned ash. Oliver would rise from his rug, stretch his front legs out long, and pad softly across the floor to stand beside her, his warm flank pressing gently against her skirt. Together, they would watch the eastern horizon turn from slate gray to bruised purple, and finally to a pale, clear amber as the sun cleared the top of the timberline. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Black coffee for Margaret, a measured bowl of dry kibble for Oliver, eaten with slow, deliberate bites. Then came the chores. Margaret would bundle up in her heavy coat and wool scarf, and Oliver would trot beside her down the shoveled path to the red barn. Inside, the air smelled of dry timothy hay, aged cedar, and old iron. Margaret would check the latch on the side door, sweep a drift of fine snow from the threshold, and collect a small bundle of kindling for the evening fire. Oliver would patrol the perimeter of the stalls, his nose working the seams of the old boards where field mice might have nested, though he rarely disturbed them. He was a guardian who understood that his primary duty was simply to be there, a steady golden anchor in a world made cold by winter. There were small reminders, of course, that Oliver had known a harder life before he found the shelter. During the first heavy freeze of December, he developed a persistent cough that seemed to rattle deep within his chest. Margaret did not panic. She called Dr. Evans, the town veterinarian, who drove his dusty pickup out to the farm through the drifted lanes. Dr. Evans examined the dog with gentle, calloused hands, listening through his stethoscope while Oliver stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed trustingly on Margaret's face. "It is just some lingering bronchitis from his time out in the damp timber breaks," the doctor said, packing away his instruments into a worn leather bag. "He needs warmth, rest, and a few days of quiet recovery. Here are some simple remedies to help him through the worst of the coughing." Margaret followed the directions with the same patient care she had once given to Thomas during his final autumn. She prepared warm broths, placed extra wool blankets over his sleeping place by the hearth, and administered the prescribed drops and mixtures with a steady hand that invited no resistance from the dog. Within a week, the cough subsided, replaced by his steady, rhythmic breathing in the dark hours before dawn. The illness left him slightly thinner, his ribs showing a faint outline beneath his golden coat. But his eyes were clear, and his loyalty had deepened into something absolute. He followed her from room to room like a shadow cast by a low winter sun. When she sat at the wooden desk to answer letters or balance her modest accounts, he lay across her feet, his body heat soaking through her stockings and driving away the chill that always seemed to rise from the old floorboards. They were two broken histories that had found a way to weave themselves into a single, unbreakable cord. February brought the great storm, the kind of winter gale that locals talked about for years afterward. It began on a Friday afternoon with a hard, freezing rain that crusted the snowpack in an impenetrable layer of ice, followed by 24 hours of blinding, wind-driven snow that obliterated the boundary between the earth and the sky. The power lines down on the county roads snapped under the weight of the ice before evening, plunging the farmhouse into a sudden, deep silence, broken only by the howling of the wind against the north gable. Margaret did not lose her head. She had lived through 50 New England winters. She moved methodically through the cold rooms, lighting the kerosene lamps and placing them on the heavy oak tables, where their amber flames cast long, dancing shadows across the whitewashed walls. She hauled a stack of dry firewood from the porch into the kitchen, piling it neatly beside the cast-iron stove, and drew the heavy wool drapes across every window to trap what little heat remained in the timber frame. Oliver stayed close to her heels, his ears flicking at every strange groan the old house made as the sub-zero wind pressed against its siding. By midnight, the temperature inside the parlour had dropped significantly, and the cold was a physical weight that gathered in the corners and crept across the braided rugs. As the night deepened, Margaret felt a familiar weakness settling into her bones, the legacy of a constitution that had grown frail with age and the quiet exhaustion of grief. A sudden dizziness made the dancing shadows of the kerosene lamp blur together into a single smear of gold and darkness. She closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the wing of the chair, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She felt the cold pressing in from the unheated hallway, sharp and indifferent. Oliver sensed the shift in her before she could even process it herself. He lifted his head from the floor, turned around twice on her lap, and pressed his heavy, warm body directly across her knees and chest, pinning her under a dense blanket of living heat. He did not bark or whine. He simply laid his head against her shoulder, his rhythmic breathing beating against her ribs like a steady, comforting drum. In the dark, cold farmhouse, with the storm screaming outside the thick timber walls, Margaret felt the terror recede. She breathed in the clean, earthy scent of his golden fur. She placed her trembling hand on his neck and felt the strong, steady pulse of his life mingling with her own. They stayed that way for hours, two survivors of different worlds holding back the winter together in the dark. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving behind a pristine, terrifying world of white drifts that rose halfway up the porch rail. The silence of the morning was absolute, unbroken by traffic or birdsong. A little after 8 o'clock, a heavy, crunching sound broke the stillness outside. Margaret, who had recovered her strength with the coming of the light and a hot cup of black tea boiled over the wood stove, walked to the mudroom door and peered through the small glass pane. Standing at the foot of the steps was Samuel, the local baker, a sturdy man of 60 with a face weathered like an old cider press and a shovel slung over his shoulder. He looked up, saw Margaret looking through the glass, and gave a broad, relieved wave. He had spent the last 2 hours clearing a narrow trench through the drifted snow from the main road, just to make sure the old farmhouse was still standing. Margaret unlocked the heavy wooden door and pulled it open, letting in a rush of brilliant, ice-scented air that made her eyes water. Samuel did not come inside, respecting the boundaries of her privacy, but he took off his woolen cap and stamped the snow from his boots on the scraper. "Saw your smoke was a little thin this morning, Margaret," he called out across the drifted threshold, his voice hearty and kind. "Brought a fresh loaf of rye and some dry pine splits from the mill. You folks weathering the blow all right?" Margaret looked down at Oliver, who stood quietly by her side, his tail giving a single courteous thump against the floor. "We are doing just fine, Samuel," Margaret said, her voice clear and steady in the freezing air. "We have enough wood for a week and a dog who knows how to keep a fire warm." Samuel smiled, touched the brim of his cap, and turned back down the shoveled trench toward his truck. Margaret closed the door, bolted it against the cold, and walked back to the kitchen with a lighter step than she had known in years. March arrived with a sudden weeping thaw that turned the country roads into ribbons of dark mud and filled the roadside ditches with the rush of melting snow. The air smelled of wet earth, rotting leaves, and the sharp, clean promise of things stirring beneath the frost. For Margaret, this transition was always the hardest part of the year. The winter had a kind of honest finality to it, a cold shell that kept the world neatly locked away. Spring demanded something much more difficult. It demanded renewal, and renewal meant confronting the spaces where life had once been full. Yet this year was different, with Oliver trotting faithfully at her heels through the slush and puddles. The thawing fields did not feel like a reproach. They felt like an invitation. Every afternoon, once the morning chores were finished and the kitchen was swept, Margaret and Oliver took a long walk down to the lower meadow where the brook ran high and clear over the rounded stones. Oliver would wade into the shallow edge of the water, his golden coat sending up spray as he splashed after a floating stick, then shake himself vigorously on the bank, sending droplets flying into the cold air. Margaret would stand on the dry stone footing, watching him with a small, genuine smile that reached all the way to her blue eyes. She no longer felt like a spectator in her own life. She was part of the landscape again, tethered to the turning of the seasons by 4 paws and a wet nose. By the middle of April, the frost was out of the ground, and the air held the warm, damp scent of turned loam. It was time to open the barn and prepare for the planting season. Margaret had not set foot in the loft since the autumn before Thomas passed away. His tools still hung on their leather loops along the board wall. The draw knife, the hand planes, the heavy iron hammers and chisels he had used to shape the beams of the house. When she unlatched the heavy sliding door and pushed it open, the rusted iron rollers groaned in protest, and a shaft of bright afternoon light cut through the gloom, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like golden bees. Margaret stepped inside, her boots crunching on the dry chaff of last year's hay. For a moment, the weight of his absence pressed against her chest with the familiar, dull ache she knew so well. She reached out and touched the handle of his workbench. feeling the smooth indentation where his palm had worn the pine grain down to a satin finish over 40 years. Oliver walked past her, his nose low to the floor, sniffing at an old leather glove dropped near the grain bin. He turned and looked up at her, his tail giving a slow, reassuring sweep against the dirt floor. Margaret let out a long, shuddering breath, closed her fingers around the handle of the workbench, and began to sweep. She cleared away the cobwebs, stacked the old cedar flats for the spring seedlings, and opened the high window to let the clean spring breeze scour out the smell of winter. The barn was no longer a mausoleum of memories. It was a workshop once more. The town seemed to wake up all at once with the coming of April. The farmers brought their tractors out of the sheds, the church ladies began clearing the dead leaves from the perennial beds around the green, and the bakery opened its front windows to let the smell of cinnamon and yeast drift out over the brick sidewalk. When Margaret walked down into the village with Oliver trotting calmly on a braided leather lead, people noticed a change in her. She did not walk with her eyes fixed on the gravel as she had for 2 winters. Her head was up, her shoulders square beneath her blue wool shawl, and she greeted the shopkeepers by name. Samuel the baker came out onto the sidewalk to offer Oliver a small unsalted biscuit, which the dog accepted with exquisite gentleness, taking it between his teeth as delicately as if it were a communion wafer. "You are looking well, Margaret," Samuel said, wiping his floury hands on his apron. "The winter was long, but you both weathered it." "We did, Samuel," Margaret replied, her voice carrying a quiet music that had been missing for years. "We had good company." She continued down the street, stopping to admire the first yellow daffodils pushing their way up through the mulch beside the library steps. She was 76 years old, and she lived alone in a timber house 3 miles out of town, but she was no longer isolated. She belonged to the world again, and the world had quietly made room for her. That evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge and painted the western sky in strokes of bruised violet and burning gold, Margaret sat on the porch bench with her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The air was cool, but it carried no threat of frost. It smelled of damp earth and the sweet, resinous sap of the awakening maples. Oliver lay across her feet, his heavy golden body radiating a steady, comforting heat that soaked through her shoes and warmed her entire frame. Margaret looked out over the dry stalks of the garden, where the dark earth was already softening into rose ready for the seed. She did not feel lonely. She felt the profound, unshakable peace of a circle closing, of winter yielding to spring, not with a sudden crash, but with the quiet, persistent grace of things that refuse to stay buried. A soft breeze rustled the dry leaves in the gutter, and for a fleeting second she caught the faint, familiar scent of wood smoke and old flannel, as if Thomas was standing just out of sight around the corner of the porch, smiling at the way the world had turned. She did not turn her head. She simply reached down, her fingers sinking deep into the thick, warm fur of Oliver's neck, and stroked the soft skin behind his ears. The dog leaned his weight against her ankles, let out a long, contented sigh, and closed his eyes. The long winter was over. The first Saturday of May brought a brilliant, sunlit morning that drew the entire town out onto the green. Children ran across the fresh grass, their laughter echoing against the white clapboard walls of the meeting house. Dogs of every description chased tennis balls across the lawn, their owners chatting in small, lazy circles beneath the newly leafed-out maples. Margaret sat on the green wooden bench beneath the old oak, her hands resting quietly in her lap over the folds of her burgundy skirt. Oliver sat upright beside her, his golden coat gleaming in the warm sunlight, his intelligent brown eyes tracking the movement of a robin pulling a worm from the damp turf. She had come down for her weekly provisions, but she had lingered on the bench to watch the town wake up to the season. The air was sweet with the scent of lilac and cut grass. She felt light, balanced, and entirely at home in her own skin. Life had not asked her permission to go on, but for the first time in years, she was glad it had refused to stop. She watched a young mother push a stroller past the fountain, her face flushed with the simple, tiring joy of early motherhood, and she felt a sudden, sharp surge of gratitude for every grey hair on her head and every year she had been permitted to walk this green earth. A few yards away, moving with slow, hesitant steps along the gravel path that bordered the common, an older woman caught Margaret's attention. She looked to be around 70, dressed in a dark, heavy wool coat that seemed entirely out of place in the warm May sunshine. Her silver hair was pinned up in a hurried twist, and her face held the pale, exhausted look of someone who was walking through a world that had gone grey overnight. She carried a small, woven market basket by the handle, her knuckles white with tension. Margaret watched as the woman paused near the edge of the grass, looking around the crowded park with an expression of profound, isolated bewilderment, as if she had been set down in a foreign country where she did not speak the language. Margaret knew that look. She had worn it every single day for the first 6 months after Thomas left. It was the look of a person standing on the shore while the tide went out, watching everything they had ever known drift away into the grey horizon. Margaret did not call out or jump to her feet with easy platitudes. She knew that grief was not something to be cured by cheerful advice. It was something that required patience, presence, and the quiet dignity of a shared silence. Margaret rose from the bench, her joints stiff but reliable, and smoothed down the front of her cardigan. Oliver stood with her instantly, his golden body pressing against her skirt, his dark eyes fixed on her face with unquestioning trust. Together they walked across the soft turf toward the woman on the path. The woman did not look up until Margaret was standing a few feet away, casting a long, gentle shadow across the gravel. Her blue eyes, rimmed with the pink of long, sleepless nights, looked up with a flash of defensive surprise, as if she expected someone to offer pity she could not bear to receive. Margaret did not offer pity. She offered something much rarer and much more real. She stopped a respectful distance away, her hands resting lightly on the leather lead, and let Oliver take 2 slow steps forward. The dog lowered his head, his floppy ears framing his gentle eyes, and pressed his soft black nose against the hem of the woman's dark wool coat. The woman drew in a sharp, ragged breath. Her fingers trembled as they uncurled from the handle of her basket. She looked down at Oliver, then up at Margaret's warm, lined face, and in that quiet exchange, 40 years of unspoken sorrow passed between them like water moving from one deep pool to another. The woman sank slowly to her knees on the gravel, ignoring the damp dust, and buried her fingers deep into the thick golden fur behind Oliver's ears. A single tear broke free from her lashes and tracked down her cheek, but her mouth relaxed into the first faint, trembling hint of a smile she had known in months. Margaret stepped forward, placed a warm, steady hand on the woman's shaking shoulder, and spoke the only words that mattered. "The winter is over, dear one." The woman looked up, her eyes clearing as she felt the solid warmth of the earth beneath her knees and the steady, unbreakable rhythm of life beating against her hand. Around them, the town of Oakhaven hummed with the bright, indifferent noise of spring, but in that small circle of shade beneath the old oak, time stood still, holding 2 lives safely in the palm of its hand. Oliver let out a soft, contented sigh, his tail sweeping the dust of the path, and for the first time in a very long time, the world felt entirely whole. Some stories do not end with a grand arrival or a miraculous rescue. They end the way the seasons change, slowly and without fanfare, until you wake up one morning and realize the cold has finally lifted from your bones. The house on the hill stands just as it always did, its timber seasoned by the weather, its floors worn smooth by the passage of years. The fire is laid in the hearth, the boots rest by the mudroom door, and the garden waits for the morning sun. Margaret turns from the porch rail, her hand resting on the golden head of the dog who brought the spring back to her door, and walks inside to close the day.